So, I was thinking about how to explain Voltaire, and one of the things I was thinking about with regard to this is thinking about the question, what's Voltaire got against optimism? Candide is clearly a satire around the idea of optimism. What's wrong with optimism? A lot of people like optimism. Optimism is supposed to be a good thing. To ask Oprah, she loves optimism. She talks about it on a lot of occasions. So what's wrong with optimism exactly? Well, I think part of it is understanding exactly what we mean by optimism and what Voltaire has in mind when he talks about optimism. In the 20th century, 21st century I guess, way of thinking about optimism, we tend to think about it in kind of an ambiguous way. On one hand, we have this idea that it's the best of all possible worlds working out here, right? The best of all possible things, the best outcome, the optimum, where the word comes from. But we also have this idea of dwelling in the most hopeful aspects or situations of a subject. And I want to make that distinction because Voltaire, on one hand, rejects the first part. He rejects the whole idea of an optimum, an optimism, in the philosophical sense that's coming out of the rationalists. But, and this is an important thing to realize, he embraces the hopefulness. And this is something to keep in mind. You can embrace hopefulness while completely and utterly rejecting optimism. Indeed, one of the things that you see in Candide is a necessity for embracing hopefulness in order, in the face of rejecting optimism. Indeed, that's the only way in which we can ultimately be free. So, how does this work? How do we embrace this hopefulness while rejecting this optimism, and how does it lead towards freedom? Right? This is the question. Well, on one hand, I guess, you could see Voltaire talking about optimism and see it as being a profoundly stupid thing. And he has a few reasons for this. Reason number one why optimism is stupid is the ubiquity of suffering, of injustice, and of ignorance in the world. Voltaire's satire, Candide, is filled with examples of this. Really, it's filled with overblown, hyperbolic examples of this. That's part of what makes it amusing. But what he demonstrates in the midst of this, and he demonstrates quite well through the satire, is that there's no comprehensible reason for these afflictions to be in the world the way they are, right? There's nothing that explains this or makes this better. There's nothing that mollifies this or rectifies this or makes any of these things work. As a matter of fact, it's the incomprehensibility of these deficiencies in the world that defeats so much of what's behind the idea of the best of all possible worlds, right? And because even if it is, it leaves us with this sense of injustice, it leaves us with this sense of ignorance, it leaves us with this sense of suffering. And if somehow all this stuff is supposed to be taken care of simply by the fact of, oh, well, if we could only see the bigger picture, it would all seem all right, you know, maybe that's all right in perfect world. Maybe that's all right from God's point of view, but I got news for you. No one's ever going to have God's point of view. It doesn't make any sense. And this is a very, very large problem for Voltaire. There's a second thing, closely related reason to this too, that Voltaire gets into as far as the stupidity of optimism, at least as a philosophy goes. And that is the way in which this best of all possible worlds philosophy that Pangloss keeps spouting and that Candide carries on in the name of Pangloss. It's not that it's necessarily wrong. It may in fact be that this is the best of all possible worlds. It may in fact be that all this is for a design and purpose. And indeed, that is something that Voltaire, in some occasions, is willing to even accept. What the problem is that even if this is correct, even if this is the best of all possible worlds, it's meaningless to talk about it, right? We have no access to what this concept is. We have no way of knowing if it's correct or if it has any place or play in our thinking. And what's more is that quite often this best of all possible worlds is used in a very self-serving way that Voltaire observes. We have no access to these ideas because we use our reasoning to justify often quite what we would like. We use it to justify saying, well, it's for the best. And I think Voltaire is very insightful with regard to this. Think how often in your life at one point or another you've observed, maybe even you yourself have said that, well, it's really for the best. And you didn't mean it's really for the best. Rather, what's meant is, well, I'll find a way to make sense out of it. Now, perhaps that's a necessary psychological maneuver people make, but it ain't using reason to correct the code in the system that is the world. All it is a self-serving intellectual maneuver. And this is something that Voltaire is observing. So, let's take stock of some of the problems that we got with optimism so far. Problem number one with this is that it doesn't explain the injustice. It doesn't explain the suffering. It doesn't explain the ignorance. It doesn't explain all the things that are wrong, because these things just happen because they happen. They're incomprehensible to us. Secondly, even if it were the case that this was correct, it's meaningless to us because we don't have a God's-eye point of view of these things. And third of all, we use these ideas in a self-serving way. We use the idea of the best of all possible worlds, not because it actually is the best of all possible worlds, but more to wash out and wipe over our weaknesses, our shortcomings, our insecurities, all sorts of things like this. So there's all these sorts of problems. There's another problem Voltaire comes up with this too, and this is especially true when you look at Pangloss himself, I think. But you see it also, you see it richly done in the Grand Inquisitor that gets things run through with him. You see it in all sorts of justifications in England and in France. You see it everywhere. And that is the way in which reason is in a rather tragic position in the play of life for human beings. Because reason is blind to itself, right? And what's more, it's a slave to the will. Here's what I mean by that. And you might have observed this in your own life at one point or another, but it's a very important thing to keep in mind. It's again, a great insight on Voltaire's part. Reason is very, very good at clarifying what it knows. But the problem is that that's all reason can do. It can only work with what it already has access to. And that wouldn't be a problem if we were, I don't know, a solitaire game program or something like that. The problem is we're human beings who hold knowledge in a way where we are always incomplete. Always. All our knowledge is incomplete. You probably don't even know what that is. That's the beloved philosophy dog Petunia. Say hi, Petunia. Yeah, what a good dog. All knowledge is incomplete. And the problem with that is that if that's the situation we're looking at, all the knowledge we hold in our mind is incomplete. And our reason is unaware of that incompleteness because it's only aware of what it has access to. One of the things that does is it creates a situation where someone goes into something and believing they know everything they need to know, and they have no idea what they need to know. The only thing that can be certain is they're wrong. Does this remind you of all great catastrophes that you've ever observed from the Iraq War on back? Well, it should, because this is the same epistemological problem that we're talking about. There's a kind of hubris, a strange blind vanity to reason operating on its own that Voltaire is critiquing here. It only knows itself. It thinks that's all it needs, and yet that makes it utterly ill-equipped in order to operate in the world. What's more, it puts us in a position where we are absolutely a slave to our wills. Again, we see this a little bit with this whole theme of self-serving aspect of the best of all possible worlds and the optimism that encapsulates that view, right? That we use our will to have what we would have, to pursue what we'd like to pursue, to go after what we would like to justify. And then reason blindly comes along, gives that justification, and can't critique itself with regard to that. The will, in other words, makes reason its slave. And reason doesn't even know that it's its slave. That's what it does within this view, right? And think about what that means. That means that if all we have is reason, or if all we believe that we have is reason, and that we are in a world that is the best of all possible worlds because we can use reason in order to understand the way things work, not only are we in a situation where reason will not free us, we're in a situation where reason will enslave us. This is an important point for Voltaire. Reason will enslave us because it cuts us off from the real issues that we have to deal with. It cuts us off from mastering our will. It cuts us off from the way in which knowledge about the world really manifests in us, right? It can't guide the will, and it can't set us free. This is an important lesson to get with this. So, we have the incomprehensibility of the shortcomings, the suffering, and the injustice, and the ignorance of the world. We have the meaninglessness of the idea. We have the way in which it's self-serving, and we have the way about why it's self-serving, right? That reason can't help get us through this. Now, all that would seem to be enough of it. But there's one more thing on top of it. And it is in a theme that you've probably noticed within this work, namely that Voltaire is maybe a little bit critical of religion. Why do you suppose that's the case? Why is he so critical of religion? Well, it is the blindness of this reason alone, combined with the vices and venality of mankind, that drives us to embrace our own enslavement in the form of religion. How is religion enslaving exactly? Because most people think that religion, well, not most people, but many people in our culture have the feeling that religion is supposed to set you free. Clearly, this is not Voltaire's point of view. What's his problem with it? Why is it the great crescendo to this criticism that he's putting? Well, it has to do with the way that religion works. It's not even just what it has to do with, because it's important to realize Voltaire, and I want to say this right at the beginning of this, I'll probably repeat this a couple times, but Voltaire wasn't an atheist. He wasn't. And actually, you might keep in mind in Candide, not every religious person is stupid or corrupt. There is one good person in this, one good religious person in this, right? Jacques, the Anabaptist. Now he gets knocked off, and just outside of Portugal. He gets thrown overboard by the selfish sailor. But he is a worthwhile, decent guy, and he does do useful, worthwhile things in the world. So it's not just that religion is for screw-ups, and it's not just that religion is wrong, because neither of these are actually what Voltaire thinks. So what's the problem with religion, and why is it such a problem in relation to this best of all possible worlds thing? Well, It's the way that religion generally does business. First of all, religion proceeds by embracing dogma. It embraces dogma, right? And what's wrong with dogma? Well, you know what dogma is. Dogma, this isn't dogma, this is a dog. Dogma, on the other hand, it's a great dog too. This is a philosophy dog. Dogma, on the other hand, is accepting something entirely on the basis of the truth of a position, entirely on the basis of authority, right? So, this is how religion proceeds. It's true because so saith the Lord, or something like that. What exactly, philosophically, is wrong with that? Because if we're going to walk the walk, we have to give an explanation for that. Well, dogma deprives us of our capacity to experience, to test, to make judgments about the world, and to and ends up calling this deprivation a form of belief, right? This is what it does. It robs us, in other words, of the tools, epistemological tools, we most need for dealing with the world. Something else. Second thing. Religion also proceeds, not just by embracing dogma, but along with dogma, by embracing superstition. It appeals to justifications of the world without the use of our higher capacities. So, even when you could begin to use reason in a meaningful, functional way, which Voltaire is entirely in favor of, he's not, please remember, he's not saying there should be no place for reason at all. He's not saying that. There should be. Reason should help us critique. Reason should help us consider. Reason should help us sharpen our thoughts. It's only that reason can never complete things. Reason will not save us. Reason is not the answer. Right? It's only a piece of the equation. But reason is something that's wiped off the table with superstition, right? So that we don't have any appeal, the superstition that religion that proceeds with, so we don't have any appeal to our rationality or our higher faculties for judgment. So, religion proceeds through embracing dogma. Religion proceeds through embracing superstition. And these weaken us. But most of all, and this is, if there is anything other than the best of all possible worlds that is satirized in Candide, it's this. Religion relies on intolerance. Again, much like my dog who's now leaving. Relies on intolerance in order to affirm itself. So that it appeals to our basest instincts, right? Tribalism, requiring of affirmation of truths on the basis of simple dogmatic authority, playing into our fears, our insecurities, doing all these things and trying to move us to act without any basic degree of self-possession. Some of you may have heard of a little joke that goes around nowadays, the Four Horsemen of Atheism. Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris. They're four writers, and all of them, they have some philosophical training. Daniel Dennett's actually a professional philosopher. The others have philosophical training, but they write in a very popular style about atheism, right? Pushing for atheism. They're all good writers. They're all interesting thinkers. But I'll tell you what, these guys, as engaging and interesting as they are not whistling a new tune. They have lifted a whole bunch of their arguments out of Voltaire and David Hume, who we'll also be talking about shortly. So, you see then, to bring this back home to why optimism philosophically isn't a good idea, that optimism, the greatest problem of optimism is manifested in the way that it gets wrapped up with religion and what religion does. It's not that religion is hypocritical. He doesn't really criticize or moralize about the hypocrisy. He satirizes it. But the reason that he satirizes it, Voltaire satirizes religion, is because it's something that operates in a way that deprives us of our capacities. It gets us wrapped up in the worst aspects of ourselves and deprives us of the strong points of reason instead of putting us in a position where we can exercise our own autonomy and our own strength. Right? This is where it leaves us. As a final note on this, I want to say too that it's important to realize that Voltaire was not anti-religious. That is to say, he wasn't an atheist anyway. He was in fact what's called a deist. He referred to himself on a number of occasions as a theist, but he is a deist, probably more accurately described as a deist, which is a philosophical position that basically asserts that God is this non-anthropomorphic, not really even conscious designing principle that simply designs the world, isn't a part of the world, doesn't care about the world, doesn't have emotions or passions about the world, doesn't have a vision for the world, and doesn't even necessarily have a purpose for the world, just has a design for the world, and that the world proceeds according to this design, according to natural laws. Another famous deist who you may have heard of is Thomas Jefferson, who, amongst other things, put out his own edition of the Bible, where he he took all the moral lessons that he thought were worthwhile in the Bible and he kept them in, and then he took out all the things that he thought were either dogma, superstition, or from an earlier period of human rational development, which made for a much smaller Bible, but it made for a whole bunch of sermons. And the Psalms. He kept most of the Psalms. Anyway, so deism. It was a philosophical position about the idea of God, very popular in the 18th century, very popular with a number, not certainly all, but a number of the Founding Fathers, most notably Thomas Jefferson. Something that represents a way of looking at religion and religious belief that goes against the dogma, the intolerance, the superstition that was so much a weakness of an earlier age. And for Voltaire, it was looking to these things, to this kind of freedom that you have inside of yourself, and recognizing the open-endedness of the world that becomes important. Now, I guess the last thing I want to bring up here is why be hopeful, given what I've said? Because, I've been talking about how the world's filled with all sorts of terrible things, that these terrible things are incomprehensible, that even if we could comprehend them, they're meaningless, that we often use rational ways of accounting for this in a self-serving manner, that reason is often blind to the will and enslaved by it as a result, and that as a result of that, we all fall into religion and become even deeper slaves than we already were. Sounds pretty grim, right? And this might be some of the grimness that comes out of Voltaire. Why be hopeful if that's the case? Well, she's wagging her tail now, so she's pretty happy about things. Well, there's a couple of reasons why. And these are not ever put forward, I don't think, quite explicitly in Candide, but they are certainly they are implicit. And I think actually if you read it with a certain sensibility and sensitivity, you can see it, especially at the end, and especially in the philosopher Martin. First of all, you have to keep in mind that for Voltaire, as for another number of other philosophers who we are going to be shortly talking about in the coming into the 18th century, human knowledge is inherently incomplete, right? We can never know or be perfectly aware of what we don't know. We never know things entirely. We never know what we don't know entirely. That might seem a little both obvious and perplexing at once, but just think about it for a second. Think about any idea you know. Think about things that you knew growing up, about your family, about your background, about your job, about your spouse, about whatever. And one of the things you'll find if you look at the ideas is that you know a number of things about them, and you may know them very well and very intimately. I'm sure you do. But if you ask, well, are there parts that I realize I don't know? You'll probably say, yeah, there are. What could I know that I know completely, right? And then if you ask yourself, all right, so there's parts I know I don't know. Are there parts that I'm not aware that I don't know? I don't want to sound too much like Donald Rumsfeld here, but are there parts that I'm unaware of that I don't know about? Well, I don't know, right? I mean, I don't know what I don't know. And if that's the case, I'm never in a position to assess myself. Now, that might seem like a downer on one hand. That's a downer certainly if we had all our chips on optimism, right? Certainly seems that way. But it also means, and think about this, that there is always possibility for hope in those things that we know in the world. There's always possibility for hope in it. Because there's always a way that something new can come into the world, right? There always is. It's not that to say that it will come in the world. It's not to say that it can be caused. It's to say that in terms of the way we know it, there's always room for that possibility. And insofar as that's the case, there's always room for hope. Think about this in particular with Candide's conversations with Martine. And also when he's roaming around South America and trying to find his way around El Dorado and things like that. There's always room for hope. There's always a way in which something could become better. We don't know that it will. We can't expect that it will. There's a kind of hubris in there, isn't it? Thinking that it will be, isn't it? But there's always room for hope with that. And you should take comfort in that. You should feel the significance, almost the blessing, that one can always hope, because it's part of the way in which ideas dwell in our minds. Even when we can only hope against all hope, and hoping seems absolutely absurd, we still can do it, and do it reasonably, because of the way in which things are held in our mind. Right? There's one more thing, too, that leaves room for hope open besides us. And it's the other side of the coin of the incomprehensibility of the injustice and suffering and ignorance in the world. And that is that fate is unfathomable. Right? It's something that we cannot come to know. We cannot come to know it because of the way in which our minds think about things. As we were saying, as a long expression about reason, we can't come to know it. But it's also something that we can't come to know because it hides itself by virtue of its universality. Just think for a moment. What would it be to know fate? I don't mean to know your fate. Maybe you could know what will happen the moment of your death. Maybe you'll find that out. Go see some gypsy and she'll turn over the card and say, "Oh, 2038, May 12th. Be ready." Maybe she'll say that to you. But even if she does, that's not knowing what fate is. What would it be to know, fate. You can't know that. It is literally unfathomable. So even if there is fate, we can't access it. There's no meaning to it. And again, while that might be a negative thing if you got all your chips behind optimism, it's actually a very positive thing because it means that we can treat it utterly reasonably as though it's open, right? On one hand, what will be, will be. I suppose that is true. But its being is to us and can only be to us open. And that's liberating. And you see that in Candide. When he, at the end, is saying, what shall we do? We shall set to work. Do you know why he's saying that? It's not because of a Protestant ethic. It's because he's saying, what else are we to do in the world? We stand here with everything before us, with a world, an ocean of possibilities before us. And all we can do is look at that and try to find some way to begin to walk through that and deal with that. And that means we proceed as we can. In the conversations, the threads that I've been seeing going on here, one of the things that, a question that was asked was, well, is this a kind of acceptance? This isn't acceptance exactly. Voltaire is not advocating an acceptance of fate. As a matter of fact, that's, for those of you who are interested, that line of thinking is probably closer to the ancient philosophy of Stoicism, the Greco-Roman philosophy of Stoicism. I think more of what's going on with Voltaire is to say, well, there is a will and a way to the world, it seems, and perhaps we can know aspects of it, or can try to bring ourselves in line with it. But we can't simply come to accept it because it's not something that we can either accept or not accept. Rather, what we can do is know what we have, where we are right now, and we can manifest that knowledge through action and through hope. Right? So, this is what we have. We have a world that is filled with difficult things, that can't be understood, that we're never in a position to understand, that often tricks us and can make us think that we are in charge of all sorts of things that we're not, and that leads us into all sorts of bad ideas, like religion, and bad habits, as far as Voltaire is concerned. But we still have room to hope, real room to hope, not just, oh, we can hope. We really have room to hope, if you think about the way we know things. There is always room for possibility in the way the world works. And from that, the last thing I would say with this, there is real freedom in the world. There really is for Voltaire. There's real freedom in the world, because even if things are determined, even if things are set down, even if things are fated, it doesn't make a difference to us. We do have the power to reason, we just can't put all of our chips behind it. We do have a will to push us forward in the world. It's just something that has to be tamed. We do have the capacity to experience and to learn. We simply have to be as even-handed and level in our judgment as we can be. But we exercise those things, and for whatever else we're doing, we come to be as much as we can be in that moment. We are free, and that is what we're pursuing. That is what Candide is on the very tip of in his nice little commune at the very end.